All right, my English teacher friends, Christian Kuhn coming at you with another writing workshop video, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of composition. So this one's going to get a little strange, and I should probably explain the impetus behind it. So I've been really diagnosing everything that's sort of wrong with my classroom, and I think a lot of other teachers' classrooms ever since the pandemic. And I've done exercises and diagnostics on why there's an engagement gap. So students don't seem to be engaging like they did a few years ago. That makes me sound like an old curmudgeon teacher, veteran teacher. Cell phones seem to be a perennial problem. And now we have the added element of ChatGPT cheating. And I thought I covered all of those, and I thought that was kind of like the trifecta of all of my woes in the classroom. And then it occurred to me the other day, it's not. I think there's something that supersedes all three of those factors, and it's this. Students have an inability to focus. So I run writing workshops in my classroom that look pretty much like my YouTube channel in terms of how I teach teachers and other students how to approach writing. And sometimes I look out upon my audience and their eyes are just broadcasting static. And I said, I'm a child of the 80s. And a lot of the things that we had that our parents and older generation thought were distractors or diluting us, I think actually helped me to sustain focus and have stamina in terms of my focus. Things like Rubik's Cube, even the video games that we played back then, like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, really helped me with my focus. And then, I play guitar and I could sit down and figure out a song for like 3 hours. And a lot of my students just don't have that tenacity. They don't have that stamina. So what I'm going to do in this writing workshop is focus on my Rubik's Cube focus template around a poem called Getting Used to It by Sarah Gambito. And what we're going to do is cobble together the entire essay while manipulating and pulling the strings of my template. And ultimately, it works like this. There are 6 sides to a Rubik's Cube, and there are 6 things that you need to do in order to have a stellar literary analysis come to fruition. So what I'll do is walk you through all 6 of those moves and cobble the essay together bit by bit. So introduction to the body paragraphs, and I got a couple of conclusion paragraphs as well. So you'll see this come to life right before your eyes. So let me explain the unit a little bit. Oftentimes, I do things called poetic sevenths, and what I mean by that is this. So I will group 7 poems that have a thematic thread. And for this unit, I have 7 poems that all reference a Rubik's Cube, and here they are for you. Now, in terms of modeling, I get asked this question a lot. Don't students just steal your thunder, Christian, and don't they just copy you? And here's my way around that. We studied 7 poems together, and I'm going to write the exemplars and models using Getting Used to It by Sarah Gambito. The students can choose any of the other remaining 6 poems, but they cannot write their essays about getting used to it. That's my poem, all right? Out of the selection of 7, that's going to be the one that I draw my models and exemplars. And that way, it cuts down on the mimicry and the theft. And they're generating their own ideas. They're just pulling the strings of my templates. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. And all of those poems you can find at Poetry Foundation. That's where I located them. So the first question out of the gate is this. So how do I write the introductory paragraph, right? Kids looking at a blank screen, blank sheet of paper, they intuitively are going to ask that question. But before we look at introductions and I get into my templates of the declarative and the inverted thesis, I always say this, right? You got to Bob Ross your instruction. So in order for this essay to come to shape, I have to get to my proverbial easel and canvas, just like Bob Ross. Use a template. He always used the wet on wet technique, and quote unquote paint with my students. So I'm going to paint 3 introductory paragraphs for you. I'm going to paint 2 body paragraphs for you, and then I'll paint a couple of conclusion paragraphs. And in doing this, the whole process gets nicely demystified for students. They'll know exactly how to execute this essay from start to finish. There's a fundamental difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. And what you're going to take a look at is direct explicit teaching. So what I've done for this particular writing workshop is kept the prompt very generic. I don't want to pigeonhole us into anything. So I'm just going to say, create a prompt and basically state this: student perform literary analysis of a poem. And when we ask that of students, if we were going to put some crafty wording around it, a la College Board FRQ1, FRQ2, for the AP Lit exam, implicit in our prompt are going to be two questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? These two questions are at the hub of every thesis for literary analysis, no matter the genre. So as long as students are answering these two questions in their introductory paragraph, they're guaranteeing themselves the thesis point if they've read the poem correctly. So let's talk about what the inverted thesis is, because those that are familiar with my work, you know that my students always invert the thesis for literary analysis. For rhetorical analysis, they will declare, and then for synthesis, argument, persuasion, research, it's a 50-50 coin flip. And if you want some information on the difference between the declarative and the inverted, just hop into my YouTube channel and take a look around. So this slide right here is kind of a graphic representation of what the inverted thesis looks like. I make graphic organizers out of triangles, and basically this is a triangle upside down on its head. So you end with the thesis. So go back to what I just told you. Implicit in the prompt, you have two questions. What is the authorial intent? Is going to be 3 sentences. The student's going to take 3 sentences to answer that question. Authorial intent gets 3 sentences. That constitutes the context and the background. And then the last sentence, when you answer the question about construction of meaning, that's the thesis statement. So what terms, devices, techniques does the author use to construct the meaning of the poem? An introductory paragraph is always going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So we're going to go 3 sentences authorial intent, 1 sentence construction of meaning. But there's other ingredients in this. And this is where we get into briefly my Word Study Academy and my Nuance Academy. So I inherit my students the day after Labor Day every year. And from day one, I run an intensive word study academy with them. And I know that there's a seismic vocabulary void with each and every generation that I inherit. So I have to do something to help my students augment their vocabulary. So I have hundreds of vocabulary exercises. And what you'll see in these student samples here is quite a bit of tier 2 level vocabulary. So by tier 2, I mean simply your average run-of-the-mill SAT level caliber words. So we know that students need to cop a certain academic diction in their writing. I don't want them overdoing it. I don't want them to sound like goons or be overly pedantic or contrived, but enough academic diction to suffice to say this is an academic sounding paper. Sentence constructs. This is a staple of my Nuance Academy. Many of you know that I use a seminal text called Write It Right by Strunk and White. And in it, they have something called Rule Number 18. And Rule Number 18 posits that there's 12 different ways to cobble together a single sentence. So as my students try to achieve voice, rhythm, and flow, you're going to see them, be kind of veritable syntactical ninjas and do some really clever things with their sentences at the sentence level in order to get that sophistication point, if we're going to talk in terms of AP literature. But I talk about sophistication in my on-level classes as well. So that's going to be everything that we're going to try to execute within the space of those 4 sentences. So just to recap, 3 + 1, 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning for a classic quintessential inverted thesis. So let's take a look at student number 1. So they're going to do this 3+1 paradigm. So in the last sentence, listen for the terms, the devices, the techniques. The 3 sentences are just going to address authorial intent. Note the vocab, note the sentence structure. So I'll take it from the top. If one cannot find a bit of levity, even amidst the gravest of situations, then their life is easy fodder to become the punchline in a bad joke. When life presents the 2 sides of its face, man tends to split into halves as well. Those who are doom and gloom in their perception, and those who prefer to tread through life with a light sense of humor. And no matter what the circumstance, going the route of humor always seems to be the right course to diffuse any amount of strife and tension. Sarah Gambito highlights these sentiments in Getting Used to It through the stark dichotomy of the father and uncle, as well as through her employment of imagery. So those of you who are on the other side of the screen might say, man, that's a really good introduction. I can't believe a student wrote that. That's pretty stellar. And I would agree. Out of the gate, this student is off to a phenomenal start. So that's a blazing start. I think if we're talking in terms of AP, literature, College Board, that student is in contention for the sophistication point, and they've definitely earned the thesis point. But let's break this down and really highlight the Rubik's Cube aspect of this. So everything that is in that introduction can be broken down this way. The student had 3 sentences of authorial intent. The student ended with the thesis, so you can hear the terms, the devices, the techniques in that last sentence, and all you do is you focus on, the most germane, the ones that drive the poem. There's definitely some tier 2 in there. The sentence constructs are pretty supple, and it was exactly 4 sentences. So let's look at sample number 1 again, and just break it down here in a color-coded manner. So as you can see here, I have the 3 sentences highlighted in red. The tier 2 level words are highlighted in green. And then the construction of meaning sentence, the inverted thesis, the last sentence is in blue. So let me take this from the top again so that you can see it a second time and really grasp what I'm getting at here with this template. If one cannot find a bit of levity even amidst the gravest of situations, then their life is easy fodder to become the punchline in a bad joke. And that's like the exigence of the whole poem. That's the aha. That's the Jesus moment of the poem. When life presents the 2 sides of its face, man tends to split into halves as well. Those who are doom and gloom in their perception, and those who prefer to tread through life with a light sense of humor. And no matter what the circumstances, going the route of humor always seems to be the right course to diffuse any amount of strife and tension. So listen to this last sentence here. You got the terms, the devices, techniques, and again, focus on the salient ones and don't make it a literary terms dumping ground. Just 1 or 2 is all you need. Sarah Gambito highlights these sentiments in Getting Used to It through the stark dichotomy of the father and uncle, as well as through her employment of imagery. And that would be a perfect inverted thesis. So how does this Rubik's Cube come into play? Probably should have stated this at the start of the video, but it's fine to backtrack here. So I have a Dollar General near me, and one day I walked in there and I said, "Oh, they have 4 Rubik's Cubes for $1, and they're these little cheap Rubik's Cubes." So I bought a class set, so this lesson plan, set me back like $8. And the kids are manipulating the Rubik's Cube as they're manipulating the strings of my template. So if it's a flawless introduction, then one side of the Rubik's Cube is complete. So let's say one side could be blue or one side could be green. So one side of the 6 is complete. We're one sixth of the way through our essay at this stage of the game. So what I do is I have my students either peer edit, or if it's early in the year, they come to me and I say, everything's copaesthetic in your introduction. Make one side of your Rubik's Cube a uniform color. So this might be confusing. I get that. So I'm going to show you 2 more times how to do this. So let's roll it again. Let's do this all over again and take a look at student number 2. Again, we're going with this 3+1 paradigm, tier 2 vocab, sentence constructs. Take a look. The difference between a bad joke and a good joke is that the latter tends to hit too close to home and rub one's face in a reality they would much prefer not to reckon with. This is especially true of jokes whose narrative thread is woven through someone's deepest sense of vulnerability. Security is a desired human trait. We all seek and value security, but when that foundation is unstable and the butt of a joke, one can get rather riled and jolted by the teller of the ruse. Gambito arrives at such a truth through the contrasting depiction of two immigrant brothers whose sense of humor is diametrically opposed. Sounds very much like the first one, right? It's doing the exact same thing. So they're using the exact same paradigm, the exact same scaffold, training wheel structure. So let's break this down again. 3 sentences authorial intent. End with the thesis. We need to hear the terms, the devices, the techniques. Sentence constructs need to be supple and flowy for voice, rhythm, and flow. And it's going to be exactly 4 sentences. So I did the same in sample 2 as I did in sample 1. I've highlighted everything for you. The 3 sentences of authorial intent are in red. The construction of meaning sentence, which is the thesis statement, is in green, and black has all the tier 2 in it. So that's there for you. Now, one of the things that we didn't talk about in the first one were the sentence structures. So let's take a look at this. My students are expert at grammar, punctuation, and syntax because I hit them hard with my Nuance Academy. So my students are able to do things like that you'll see in the third sentence here with a double dash, right? Very expressive syntax. And that needs to be taught. So I have hundreds of exercises that I've created around Strunk and White's Write It Right and all of their rules. I have several in my YouTube channel, so check them out. But that's also something that we dive into deeply with my National Writing Project courses and with my consulting if you're ever interested to sign up for one of those PD offerings. So very good voice, rhythm, and flow. And again, let's always put it in terms of the highest standard. College Board, AP Lit student. This kid is guaranteeing themselves the thesis point, and if they can sustain this in the rest of the essay, they 100% are going to get themselves the sophistication point. So if the student comes to me with an introduction like this, one side of the Rubik's Cube, make it a uniform color. So again, just to really, demystify things and elucidate things very clearly, let's do it again. And yes, you can. Students, teachers looking at this, you can. This is not that hard to do. It's just going to take a little bit of practice, and your teacher's going to need to Bob Ross it for you a few times to really make it make sense. So student number 3 steps to the plate. They're going to do the exact same thing, 3 plus 1. Dumb jokes done smartly tend to be the real crowd pleasers. I love that opening line, right? And again, you get to the exigence, the aha moment, the Jesus moment of the poem in that opening line. While these jokes might be innocuous at face value, their punchlines seem to hearken one fact. Sometimes people take themselves way too seriously. Jokes, to a large extent, are suggestive barbs to loosen up and not dwell on worst-case scenarios. Now we're at the construction of meaning. The brothers in Getting Used to It straddle both sides of the dichotomy and the delicate line between a good and a bad joke. So let's break this down. You can see 3 sentences authorial intent, 1 sentence construction of meaning. Vocab is up without overdoing it. And again, look at the expressive syntax in here. You got some parenthetical statements. Student even used a colon. And I've read College Board essays for 21 years. And sometimes I could go like 500 essays and not see a dash, a colon, or a semicolon. It's just comma splice central, and kids overusing and misusing commas and periods. And this can be taught. It just needs to be explicitly taught. Bob Ross it, and be purposeful about it, and kids will be able to do what you're seeing here. All right, so if you're following along with me and running a writing workshop, probably a good place to pause. Have your students do their inverted theses. And I'm always a firm believer of this. The more writing students see, the better they become. So have students share their writing with each other, have them peer edit. They have a common language now. They know what they're looking for. So have students take a look at things, and you as teacher could also look over their shoulders just to make sure they're good in the hood. And if they've done everything up to snuff, then award them one side of that Rubik's Cube to color in a uniform color, the color of their choosing. So the next question is this: how do I write the body paragraphs? We are done with the intro, so now we need to do the bodies. Many of you are familiar with my work, and you know that for the body paragraphs, I have a template called the syllogistic method. It comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the town boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they would often throw out these juicy essential questions like, what is justice? Which is the question to the seminal text, Plato's Republic. And the great scholars and philosophers and think tankers would step to the proverbial mic and they would drop their definition of what justice is. And Aristotle would listen on and he would say, geez, why are some of my students like just crush their arguments? Some are men, some tank bomb it. They're like discursive and discombobulated. They just really can't house an argument all that well. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, aha, I got it. My really good students, my gifted orators, they have a computative mathematical approach. They're very systematic, and what they're doing is arguing syllogistically. And here's what he meant by that. A syllogism is when you argue from premise, conclusion. So let me give you an example. If I were to say premise 1, arsenic is deadly, you all would say, Christian, you're 100% correct. That is true. But if I were to counter it and say premise 2, my dog ate arsenic, you're naturally going to conclude, this isn't going to bode well for Christian's dog. That dog's going to die. So that is what Aristotle calls cogency, cogent argument. So it's very lockstep, it's very deliberate, and it's bulletproof. And when our students argue on paper, and we have to keep in mind, literary analysis is an expository mode, so they are arguing. It's not plot synopsis. They have to argue. So they have to be cogent. They have to sustain a line of reasoning. So let's take Aristotle's template or heuristic and morph it into something that we can use for the purposes of literary analysis. The first premise, as such, is going to be an argument containing the terms, the devices, techniques. This is going to take 3 sentences because we want to keep the argument central, right? College Board on FRQ 1 and AP Lang says 3 times in the directions, your argument must be central. And I tell my students on all of their expository writings, your argument must be central. So I don't want any quotes. I don't want any paraphrasing. I don't want any summation in those first 3 sentences. Centrality of the argument, take 3 sentences. Second premise begins in the 4th sentence and it's textual support. We're just going to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. We don't want to do one at the more at the expense of the other. And then the conclusion. And I really want to carefully articulate this. Syllogisms, syllogistic body paragraphs, need conclusions. Oftentimes students don't conclude their thoughts in a paragraph and they just abandon it. And therefore they have these dangling lines of reasoning that they haven't connected for the reader. So body paragraphs need conclusions, and this is the textual analysis. We're just going to link it back to the prompt, thesis, echo it all, and sum it up. So all of this takes about 10 to 12 sentences. So I'm a firm contender in this. Those 4 to 5 sentence baggers that students write, they don't cut it. And it's definitely not sophisticated writing. There's not enough support or an analysis in 4 or 5 sentences to fully flesh out and substantiate an argument. So it's got to be about 10 to 12 sentences. So let me walk you through this whole thing right here and show you what a first premise looks like. So I have an example here. And there's many components in here, so you might want to pick up a pen or a pencil and jot a couple of notes down. So first, my students use a stem that I give them, and it's this, right from the onset, comma. Students often ask the question, where do I begin my analysis in the first body paragraph? And I always say this, start where the author starts. So indicate to your reader that you have a chronology, you have sequence, you have order, right? That you're going to have a nice like method through the madness here. You have an order to it. And I like the words, the clause right from the onset, because it cues the reader into knowing that you're going to go chronologically through it, that you're going to have a sequence. So students typically steal that right from me. And then you just go cherry picking. What did Gambito do first, second, third? All right. And we're gonna approach it that way. So look how this goes. Right from the onset, Gambito objectifies the human tendency to take life too seriously. In assessing her own role on the matter, she suggests that she is impervious and square, but backtracks in her recognition that she's not without other flaws. The juxtaposition of the two brothers and their respective take on the nature of joke telling highlights this polarity. So you can see that took 3 sentences. You can hear the terms, the devices, the techniques in there. All right. So what do we have to do here in terms of having a flawless first premise? Let's talk about this, because this is going to be side number 2 of the Rubik's Cube. If the first premise is flawless, they're going to use the sentence stem to establish the chronology or the sequence. So they don't necessarily need to use my stem, but something approximate to let the reader know that there's chronology. You have to multitask the terms, the devices, the techniques. So you can hear in that example there that there are 3 terms, devices, techniques. This gets students out of the terrible tendency that a lot of kids have to go 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph metaphor, right? That's not sophisticated, and it's just not good writing. So students, the template of, especially with regards to the first premise, forces students' hands to see how the pieces connect. It has to be exactly 3 sentences. And then let's talk about what does not go in there. No quotes, no summary, no plot. And that one example right there did it perfectly. So they get side number 2 to complete with a uniform color. So let's just rehash this. The first premise is going to be 3 sentences, right? And you have to have a literary argument. What I like to do once I'm done with my first premise, if I'm going to be opening up the lid of my brain to show you how I write, I go quote hunting. So first premise is done, I go quote hunting. I go back and I look at my first premise and I say, the first premise is a promise. What have I promised my reader? And then I go get all my quotes that are germane to my promise. Since there are 3 things mentioned in that first premise, it's probably a good idea that I have 3 quotes. So let's take a look at what we do in the second premise. I have 1 more sentence stem. It's not even a full sentence, just a clause. And it's this simple. Immediately, comma. Most of my students will begin their 4th sentence with immediately, comma. This ties back to right from the onset. And it's just a little training wheel or scaffold to ensure that the kid quotes in order. So whatever they mentioned in right from the onset, that first thing, they have to have a quote and or a paraphrase that's germane and linked to that. So let's take a look here. Immediately, the father is characterized as being one given to doom and gloom, someone who you can make hot, like a strong appliance. So 4th sentence, I tell my guys, get quoting or get paraphrasing, right? And if you go back, that ties to the right from the onset. That's like the perfect quote. In fact, it's the only quote that works. So I like this template because it really gets students to quote with deliberation. So you quote, you got to analyze. Because he's wound so tight by the prospect of immigration instantaneously wrecking his life and dreams, his daughter sees him as just grown-ass people having tantrums, right? Let's talk about this. So far, the 2 quotes have been relatively silky smooth. The student's doing a good job at that. There's something called the 5-word rule that my students use. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, they should have a quote transition that sounds very conversational, you may need to bracket. So far so good, but we got to keep in mind, whenever we quote, we just can't dump a quote. We got to analyze it. So let's keep going here. Unlike her father, the narrator suggests that she's unbought, unheated, like a perfectly square morsel of lasagna. But instead of having her father's propensities, she gravitates towards the character flaw of judgment, right? So that was the very first thing that we mentioned right from the onset. So we got all of our quotes and or paraphrases for that lit term. We're good. Now we got to move on. And as such, when her uncle would prank call her father, immigration, she's left to assess this oft-repeated joke in order to make sense of it all. While the uncle crows at his punchline, the father tussles with the quality of the joke and how it rested on the bad stomach of a tensile citizenry. Right, and again, 5-word rule. All these quotes are really sink into the promise of the first premise, right? This is how you get line of reasoning, quote deliberation. And it's quote analyze, right? You just can't run from your quotes. So we just dropped a quote, let's analyze it. The narrator is not just a passive observer. Instead, she measured this silence when she was a girl and considered just how funny the prospect of deportation is. Is the subject good father or a bad good joke? The bottom line of the joke is this: we lost everything if such a call were to ever be factual and not a mere prank. But taking it one step further, the uncle's telling of this joke over and over and ever is intended to diffuse the tension of such a prospect. All right, so we have quotes and or paraphrases for all 3 of the terms we promised in the first premise. We don't want to exceed 12 sentences, and if we go over a little over 12, as long as the line of reasoning stays intact, we're cool, we're okay. But let's break down everything that's in there. All right, in terms of assigning the next sides of the Rubik's Cube. So I want to see the stem, so that though I literally call those lines of reasoning, I see them, I visually put them down on paper. So I want to see the stem of immediately or something closely akin to that. I want to see that all the quotes are aligned with the terms, the devices, techniques dropped in the first premise. A lot of teachers call that line of reasoning. I do as well. I want to see the 5-word rule in effect. I don't want to see any period and then dump the quote. I still want to see sentence constructs in tier 2 level words. And then ultimately, I want it all housed in 10 to 12 sentences. So let's see how this student is doing. Is the line of reasoning flawless? I would say in the example we just took a look at, it's flawless. That's cogent. Aristotle unequivocally would say that's a cogent argument. So I would say one side is complete for flawless line of reasoning. Do they have silky smooth quote transitions? Does it sound conversational? I would say yes. I would award one side complete. So you can see here the Rubik's Cube is all coming into play here. Tier 2, sentence constructs, grammar, punctuation, syntax. All of that is flawless. So I would say one side complete. So let's take a look at this second premise again, all the way until the conclusion, and just eyeball it for yourself here. Right, all the parts are there. So you have plenty of textual support, plenty of analysis. You can see that the student brackets as needed. So that's kind of a telltale mark of a Mr. Kuhn student. You know, my colleagues always say that my students bracket very well to keep everything conversational. And if we tie it back to the first premise, there is a quote and or paraphrase for every single promise made in that first premise. So this is done exactly. There's good vocab, good sentence structures, just like the introductions that we talked about. My students liberally use dashes, probably to a fault. I get that. I'm a big dash user as a poet myself. I completely overuse the dash. But in terms of the grammar, the punctuation, the syntax, there are no errors here. And again, throwing it back to the sophistication point that the College Board talks about, that has to be flawless. I feel if the kid's going to be in contention for the sophistication point. So let's talk about the next thing here. We're not done with this syllogism yet. To get one remaining side of the Rubik's Cube, you need to throw a conclusion on this syllogism. But you might be asking yourself, what's a conclusion of a syllogism look like? It's very easy. It's literally a link or an echo. You're going to go back to where you began. So syllogisms are circles. They come full circle on each other. It usually just takes 2 or 3 sentences. So look what this student did to conclude that first body paragraph. Whether such joke material is good or bad really doesn't matter to the narrator. What matters is that every instance of the telling ends with one common denominator, both brothers laughing, right? So that's really cool. And the student did a nice job of bringing it all back to the thesis, all back to the prompt. And it kind of echoes where the first premise began. So yet again, those of you that are writing with me, probably a good place to pause, have your students work on their first premises, have them go quote hunting, make sure everything's aligned, and award those sides of the Rubik's Cube if you are going that route. But we have to ask ourselves the question, what do we do next, right? We only have an introduction paragraph and one body paragraph. So what do we do next? It's easy. You bust out another syllogism. So my students write 4-paragraph essays on all 6 of the FRQs. I'm talking AP Lang and AP Lit. And even my on-level students typically write 4-paragraph essays. And I know many teachers are like, but what about the 5-paragraph essay? A humbug. If you're going 10 to 12 sentences for a body paragraph, you really don't need that third body paragraph. Students can cover the whole poem in 2 body paragraphs. So intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. So let me show you how I would set this up. Again, there's still so much of the poem that we have not analyzed. So let's just reload with the first premise, and I'll show you what my student did for this. So here it is, 3 sentences. You got to argue with your terms, your devices, techniques. So look at this one. The frequent mention of bird imagery is what unifies the poem. Touching upon the idea that birds flock together, Gambito is touching upon the idea that the threat of deportation is the shared plight of her people. How one deals with this stark reality is a whole separate issue. So again, they multitask here. The bird imagery is very important to the poem, but they're also going to have a heavy thematic focus. So we're going imagery and theme. So what do we do next? Go quote hunting. So you're going to need all the quotes that you're going to need for discussion of the bird imagery, and then a heavy focus on theme. So these are the quotes that we would use from the poem. There's only a couple of them, but I'm assuming that if this student is going to talk about the bird imagery, they would want the bird quotes. So one wing swigging out to its brother on the other bird is the first quote. It is important to remember who would laugh first, the perpetrator Uncle Jokester or the assailed Father Feather. And then the last one, the uncle is often referred to as crowing. So that might be something we throw in there. So then you just piece it all together, 10 to 12 sentences, focus on those sentence constructs, the 5-word rule, and, just another syllogistic body paragraph, throw a conclusion on that body paragraph just like we did the first time. All right, we're getting towards the end here. So our first body paragraph is done. Our second body paragraph is done. We wrote a killer introduction. So now we need to wrap up the essay. How do we do that? Well, in my classroom, I have a poster with 15 sentence stems for conclusions. And for literary analysis, I like to end with like a fireworks display. If you ever go see a 4th of July fireworks display, you have the grand finale. So at the end of my students' essays for literary analysis, and the same goes for rhetorical analysis, I tell them to go for the grand finale, fireworks display. Heavy focus on theme. So one sentence stem that I have is simply said, comma. And my students often run this one in such a manner. So look at what this student did. Simply said, the world is replete with glass half empty types of people. But as is clear, even if a bad joke serves as the anecdote, such individuals can be forcefully nudged into the reminder that not everything is as stark as it seems. One's response is a choice, and Gambito reminds us that laughter is always an option. So it usually just takes 3 to 4 sentences to wrap it up. And again, it's just a heavy thematic focus, kind of like a second thesis, if you will, but more generalized and, just that climatic crescendo at the end. And that's all it takes. And that is the last piece of the Rubik's Cube, the last side of the Rubik's Cube. So if they have a conclusion that looks something closely akin to what you just saw, they've solved the cube. It's all one solid cube at this moment. So very cool. Now, the thing about those Dollar General cubes, they have them on Amazon as well. They're super cheap. You can buy like a pack of 40 for $10. Instead of having kids trying to figure out a Rubik's Cube, some of them just can't. They just can't do it. You can pull apart the blocks and piece it together so that it's all uniform. Otherwise, you'll have kids for the next 2 years trying to figure out a Rubik's Cube, which is not the point. All right, we are wrapping up here. So one of the things I always tell teachers that have made it this far, happy teaching and happy writing. You have these exemplars and models for your classroom use, but I encourage you to write your own to just really, really, really demystify how to do this. And if any of you need to get in touch with me, my email address is teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Also note that I'm a lead teacher for the National Writing Project. We offer PD throughout the calendar year. And if you go to my website, which is www.teachinghowtowrite.com, there's a tab up top that says My NWP Courses. Click on that, and you can see the whole battery of things there, the whole kit and caboodle. We even have a self-paced course for those that are a little bit time crunched. And we offer things during the summer, during the academic year, during vacations. So very cool, very affordable PD. So that's there for your perusal. We're at the end, my friends. So hoping this serves you well and that your students have a good time with this one and that it teaches them how to focus on paper.